Welcome back for another episode of Uncontested. I'm your guest host, Rob Johnson, and joining me as always is the man with the proper legal background, certainly not me. That is Sean Lohman. Welcome back.
Hey, Rob, how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good.
So I want to make the listeners aware, this is part 2. So in the first part of this podcast, you spoke extremely well and in depth on the topic of Medicaid asset protection and elder law. Is that correct?
Right. That's right. And we spoke about assets that are included, things that can prevent you from qualifying for Medicaid, right? We talked about income levels. We talked about asset levels, and we'll touch on that today. But today, we're going to talk more about the planning, the tools that we use, some of the tools that we have available to help people qualify for Medicaid.
Yeah.
Long-term or elder law or Medicaid asset planning, it's estate planning. It's basic estate planning for people who are looking at the potential and the risk of going into long-term care. So who would that be? You don't have to be sick and you don't have to be disabled for this planning to come into play. In fact, doing this proactively when you're healthy is better because, for Medicaid, the longer in advance you do the planning before you actually apply for Medicaid, the better it is, the more protected your assets are. So if you're older than 65, or if you have a parent or a grandparent who's 65 or older, and certainly once you get into your 70s and once you're into your 80s, if you're that fortunate, the older you get, the more important this planning becomes and the more risky it is. So the more risky it is, I guess, not to do it. So last time we spoke in our last podcast, we talked about the high expense of long-term care in Kentucky. It's $107,000 per year on average. So that's an average nursing home. I don't know how many people say, well, I'd love to go into an average nursing home, right?
Yeah. I want to below average.
And my client, I had a client in recently who said, what is an average nursing home? And we got into that discussion. I said, exactly. Yeah. But it's just under $9,000 per month for an average nursing home. Memory care is higher though. Memory care is about $10,000 to $12,000 per month. And so nursing home care is expensive. And I'm sure everybody out there knows that. The question is, how do we pay for it? How do we pay for long-term care or nursing home care? It's the same thing, without losing everything that we have. How do we keep from spending all of that stuff that we've worked our entire life to accumulate from being just spent on a nursing home rather than preserving those assets for the people that we love, our children and our grandchildren? So I've got 4 kids. And every time I put money into my retirement, every time I put money into savings, I think about how that would benefit them down the road, not a nursing home.
Right.
And so, if you're in the same boat as me, or if, there's a loved one that you have or a charity that you want your money to go to, then this planning is for you. To review, the only insurance or governmental benefits that will pay toward long-term care costs is Medicaid. The problem with Medicaid is this: you only qualify for Medicaid if you're at or below the poverty level. So you have to have assets of under $2,000 and your income cannot exceed $2,534 per month. That's it. That's the poverty level. So our job as attorneys who do estate planning and elder law planning is to reconfigure those assets in the way that they're titled or the way that they're held so that Medicaid looks at your income and your assets differently. And it makes Medicaid look at your assets as if you fall below the income limit and you fall below the asset limit without giving up those assets. So as we said, Medicaid is looking at the total assets and the total income. So let's talk about income first. If you have income of over $2,523 per month, and that's from any source, pension, Social Security retirement, Social Security disability, veterans benefits, employment wages, alimony, pension, IRA withdrawals, and stock dividends, if those payments exceed $2,523 per month. You do not qualify for Medicaid. But don't throw in the towel, because we can help you qualify. There are ways around this. Don't think that just because you have over that amount, or your mom has over that amount coming in every month, you'll never qualify, because the government has given us ways around this. So Medicaid allows you to take your income and to run it through what's called a qualified income trust, what also is known as a Martin trust, Martin, at which point, if you run it through that trust, Medicaid will not consider those wages toward your cap. So let's set an example of how this works. If your mom falls, she has an injury to her hip, and the doctor says she needs to go into a nursing home because she needs the assistance of nurses to help her. And you need to figure out how you're going to pay this $9,000 per month bill, right? Well, if mom's income is over $9,000 per month, or $12,000 per month if you're in memory care, then great. You can pay for it out of her income, and you don't need to do Medicaid asset planning. But if mom's income is less than that $9,000 per month bill with her Social Security and her pension retirement, then where does the money come from to pay for mom's nursing home costs? Because the income limit for Medicaid is $2,523 per month. Let's say that your mom earns $3,500 per month. Well, you can spend mom's $3,500 per month and then start selling her assets and exhaust what she has to her name, leaving nothing for her kids and her grandkids when she dies. Or with Medicaid asset planning, we create a qualified income trust. You make one or more of her children the trustee of that trust. You run mom's income through that trust, at which point Medicaid says, oh, that's not income towards your income limit, and you qualify for Medicaid. And mom will meet the income portion of the qualification, and now she does have to pay that $3,500 towards her long-term care expenses, but for the income purposes, mom qualifies for Medicaid. And the ultimate goal here is to get mom qualified so that anything over and above that income amount, Medicaid pays, right? So we've qualified mom for consideration as far as income purposes go, but the biggest elephant in the room when you're talking about Medicaid is assets. What about assets? That's what I always hear about. Assets have to be sold, and you're right. The assets are the biggest problem. So to review, your assets cannot exceed $2,000. So if you are looking at qualifying for Medicaid, or your mom or your grandparent is looking to qualify for Medicaid, and you have assets that exceed $2,000, you don't qualify. And I know that's really, really low, but there's something that can be done to help. So the asset Medicaid considers as what they call included assets. That's what they call it, included assets. When seeing what they look to see what those included assets value in total. And when you look at what these are, it's just about everything that you have. I mean, we're talking checking accounts and savings accounts, brokerage accounts, certificates of deposit, stocks and bonds, savings bonds, your primary residence if you don't intend to return home. That's an included asset. And remember, if your home has more than $636,000 of equity, you're disqualified. So, you've done what you've been told to do your entire life. You've paid that mortgage payment. You got it paid off in 30 years. You celebrated with some champagne and you're done. Well, guess what? Because you have that amount of equity in your home of over $636,000, it disqualifies you. So that's something that we need to plan for to retitle that asset so that Medicaid doesn't consider that as an included asset. The cash value of life insurance. If the total face value of all your policies exceeds $1,500, the cash value of that life insurance is included. Vehicles other than one vehicle. And then I know Rob's favorite, boats and recreational vehicles.
Absolutely. How'd you know? I live on a boat.
Because you're in Michigan.
Right. That's all we do is boat.
Yeah, right. And so boats, unless you live on the boat, or unless you live in the recreational vehicle, those are considered as included assets. Loans that other people owe you, deferred annuities, and some immediate annuities, depending upon how they were purchased and when they were purchased, and retirement funds if some conditions are met. So, all of these assets are included by Medicaid and must be used, spent, or sold in the money spent before Medicaid will contribute to long term care costs.
Mm.
That's just crazy. I mean, to think that someone works their life to save for these things and to build these assets, to do what they're told to do, to save, to put money into retirement, to pay down the cost of your house. And then all of a sudden, at the end of your life, for the last 2, 3, 4 years of your life, potentially, you're being told you have to sell those to pay for those last long-term care costs, and your children or your grandchildren potentially end up with nothing. So before we discuss some basic options, we need to keep in mind that there are some time limits in the statute that you need to think of and that you need to keep in mind. People always come in to me and talk with me about this, and immediately they have heard about the 5-year look back rule. People say, I know there's a 5-year look back rule, but I don't know what it means. And so Medicaid, so honestly, one of the first questions on a Medicaid application is, have you made any gifts to anyone in the last 5 years? Therefore, if you've given anything away to friends or family, or transferred anything into a trust, anything like this, if you've made any gifts of any kind in the last 5 years, those transfers of assets are looked at by Medicaid to determine whether those assets are included in your estate. If they are one of those things that we talked about that's included and you gave it away, Medicaid is going to suck it back in and they're going to say the value of that asset has to be used or expended before we will pay anything. An example again. We're going back to mom. Mom falls, she hurts her hip, she ends up in the nursing home, and mom urgently transfers title of her house to her children to keep Medicaid from considering her house as an asset, right? We all know somebody who's talked about doing this because she doesn't intend to return to her house, and she wants her kids to be able to sell the house and not have to pay for the upkeep on the house, the insurance, the taxes, all the stuff that comes along with maintaining an empty house sitting there. Well, Medicaid is going to consider that house and its full value toward her included assets, and it will disqualify her from Medicaid. So what does that mean? It means that proactive planning before you or your loved one ends up staring down the barrel of the nursing home admission office. You do this planning, get the planning in place, starting that 5-year look back period, running as early as possible, so that when you or your loved one have to answer that question, have you made a gift in the last 5 years? The answer is no. Or if the answer is yes, it was so remote, it was 3 years, 4 years ago, that Medicaid almost doesn't care about it.
Because that's
That
the
means that
line where they would say, well, this
yeah,
obviously wasn't used to, offset or hide assets elsewhere. Because I'm sure there's a little bit of differentiation there as well. Like if you gave a wedding gift that was extravagant 4.5 years ago, they'll be able to tell the difference between that and you trying to shell assets somewhere else.
that's absolutely correct. It is, they look at the intent behind this. A lot of people, two different things. Let's say that mom and son have had a joint account since son was 30 years old and mom was in her 50s getting towards her 60s, and they both use the money out of this account, and they've done this for decades now, and mom has to include that as an asset, right? Because she's listed on there, but she states that it should be excluded because this actually is money, is an account that she owns with her son. That's one thing. Mom adding son's name to her account as she has one foot in the nursing home and one foot outside the nursing home is a totally different thing to Medicaid. So, Medicaid, like I said in the last episode, they're not stupid. They have people who go through all of these assets and look and see what they believe the intent was. And so they they know the difference between somebody who's had an account with their son for 30 years and someone who's had an account with their son for 1 year or for 1 month. And they will weigh those differently. And like you said, this proactive planning, Medicaid does weigh it differently depending upon whether this planning was done in the last 2 months or whether it was done 2 or 3 years ago or 4 years ago. You may not have hit the 5 year mark yet, but they do weigh it differently the more remote it is.
Absolutely. And that makes sense.
So,
And
yeah.
that's probably one of the few areas of the government that would actually make sense. But
But it still doesn't make sense that the same government that says you have these limits gives you a way around them.
absolutely. Yeah. 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 We have these rules, but there's also this back door you can check out. Wink. Just take 2 steps to the right and you'll find
Right, yeah,
it.
exactly, exactly. So when we talk about the planning options, the most important one I think that people look at, and probably their biggest asset, and the thing they've worked for most of their life, is their primary residence, right?
Yeah.
So for many people, this is going to be their largest asset, and you get it paid down, and it's the highest valued asset oftentimes that people have. Now remember, the primary residence is only included as a Medicaid asset if the owner does not intend to return home. So if the owner intends to return home, then Medicaid will not consider the primary residence as an available asset.
Mm.
Um, and remember, an available asset is one that has to be sold to pay for the nursing home cost. So we just, that's great, right? We just say that mom intends to return home from the nursing home, and then we don't have to use the home to pay for her nursing home costs. That's true. But in practicality, you could end up in a situation like my family did, which can be a real burden on the kids and the family of the loved ones of the person that's in the nursing home. So, in the last episode at the beginning, I talked about my grandmother who went to a nursing home. Had just gotten out of law school. I wasn't doing estate planning yet. My grandmother owned her condominium. And when she went into the nursing home, my mom and my uncle had to pay, they had to liquidate all of her assets. She had some rental properties. She had a lot of savings built up in CDs and things like that. Was the generation that put everything into CDs, right? And they had to get rid of everything. They had to spend all the CDs. They had to sell her rental properties. They had to pay. They had to sell everything. But they thought, we're going to hang on to her condo because it is the only asset that we don't have to get rid of if we say she's intending to return home. And the government's fine with that. You can be completely incapacitated, and as long as you say person intends to go home, the government will hold on to will exclude that asset. But here's the problem. They had to keep paying the fees for the maintenance on the condo. They couldn't rent it out because then it's rental property and only $6,000 of the equity can be excluded. They had to keep the electricity on, right? They had to keep the water on. They had to keep all of these. They had to keep paying the taxes. They had to keep paying the insurance. So it was a huge burden on my mom and my uncle, and I saw that. And let me tell you, it's amazing how run down an empty property can get.
Well,
I don't know if you've ever experienced that, Rob, but an empty property gets run down by nobody being there.
yeah. You
Um,
forget how much upkeep goes into a house until you're not there to
Absolutely.
do it.
So if my mom and my uncle had sold the condo, if they had said, okay, to heck with this, we're not going to spend any more money on the upkeep of this condo, what would have happened? Well, my grandmother, because she was the owner, would have received the money. It would have been in her name. And because it was in my grandmother's name, Medicaid would have said, oh, now you have to spend that $150,000 towards your long term care cost.
Mm.
It's included now as a Medicaid asset. It was not included when it was your condo, but now that you've sold it, every penny of that has to be spent toward your long term care, and Medicaid no longer pays until you're below that $2,000 threshold. So there's a better way to do this. So through proactive planning, we can transfer the home into a Medicaid asset protection trust, giving the owner the lifetime right to reside in the home, a life estate. The owner gets to reside in the home for their life, and they have the right to dictate through their planning who gets the home or the money of the home, money from the sale of the home, if and when this home is sold. So in our example, mom keeps the home out of being included as an asset by Medicaid if she transfers it into a Medicaid asset protection trust, but she gets to live in the home as long as she wants to, and she maintains control over her home, including who the ultimate beneficiaries of her home are when it's sold. Her son or her children as a whole get to be the trustees of the trust that's holding that home. They are the lifetime beneficiaries of the trust, and they are the ultimate beneficiaries. But here's the kicker: mom always gets to control who the ultimate beneficiaries are of the trust, so she can change the beneficiaries at any time. So that takes care of the home. But what about the other assets like cash, investments, stocks, bonds, rental properties, and those things? How do we take care of those assets? Well, we need to do something with those assets to make them exempt based upon the Medicaid rules. So I'm going to touch upon a couple of these briefly, but just know that there are a lot of tools out there that we can use, and they're all dependent upon what assets an individual has or what they need to be what they need to protect, what assets they need to protect. Um, and again, if you're doing this while mom is well, then there's a lot more options that we have as far as what we can do to protect your assets. For crisis planning, and we need to get mom qualified for Medicaid immediately, we look at a few different options. First, so if we're trying to get mom qualified immediately, we look at gifting money to an annuity, which then would pay for mom's long-term care costs for the Medicaid qualifying period. So if we know what the long-term care cost is, which we do because mom's needing medical nursing home care, she's talked to the admissions office, we know what that amount is. So we then talk to a company that provides annuities, and we say, okay, mom makes $3,500 a month in income. Her nursing home cost is $6,000. We need that difference to be paid per month until all of the rest of her assets are excluded from Medicaid purposes. So we move all of her assets over to this Medicaid Asset Protection Trust to start that clock running to protect mom's assets. But we take some money of mom's and we buy an annuity with it that will then pay for that monthly benefit for that period of time that we know Medicaid is going to require her assets sit there until they're excluded. Does that make sense to you, Rob?
It does. That's
Okay.
super smart.
It makes sense to me, and sometimes I hope it makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, that's
Kind
super
of the
smart.
similar money behind the annuity is you can give money to a relative or a friend and execute a promissory note in return that that individual is going to pay the monthly care of your nursing home that exceeds your income during that qualifying period. So let's say your qualifying period is 3.2 years. So you're going to give this person the cash, and that person is going to issue a promissory note that they are going to pay monthly that nursing home bill for that 3.2 year period of time. Meanwhile, all of your other assets are sitting over in this protective trust, and they're qualifying for the protection while that nursing home is being paid. So you can either do it through through an annuity, or you can do it through a promissory note. The thing with a promissory note is you really have to trust that the person is going to live up to that promissory note, right? I mean, because you don't want to go having to file suit against somebody because they're not complying with their promissory note.
Yep.
The annuity, at least, you know that money is going to be paid. Also, we can do a caregiver agreement between one or more of the kids and mom. So, and this is really interesting, Rob. Mom can prepay her children for coming in and visiting her, for providing her with assistance while she's in the nursing home, for taking her out of the nursing home for visits and for Sunday lunch. All of this can be estimated per week based upon mom's life expectancy. And you can say, okay, well, mom's life expectancy is, 5.8 years or 7 years, whatever it is. And if I visit her per week, this many hours per week at a reasonable hourly rate, how much does that amount to over that period of time? And mom can go ahead and pay that to her children, and that is excluded by Medicaid, it's not considered a gift.
Yeah, I've seen that before where it's like basically whoever's going to be managing, like basically it's like an executor. You're the person that's, you know, kind of running the operation, and you can set up. You know, the IRS likes to use the word reasonable a lot, like especially with like S corps and whatnot. Like reasonable, like that's very subjective. Uh,
Well, exactly it is. I mean, I had one person go, "Can I charge $100 an hour?" And I said, "No, you can't charge $100 an hour to go visit your
well, it depends
mom."
on how bad she
But
was. I
you
mean,
could,
who's to say?
I guess so. But let's say, but I have a client who uh, I was just talking to who lives out of Kentucky and travels to Kentucky once a week to make sure that the person, the caregiver who is taking care of mom, who the family is hired to take care of mom, to make sure mom's doing okay, to make sure all of that is going okay, to make sure bills are paid, things like that. Those expenses can be prepaid through this type of agreement, through a caregiver agreement, and it can really dissipate the
Mm,
estate, as you can see. So, you know, we can get rid sometimes of tens of thousands of dollars out of the estate by doing a caregiver
mm,
agreement. Another way that we discussed last time, and a really good way to reduce the value of the estate, is through prepaid funeral expenses. And I know that sounds morbid, but let's face it, we're all going to have to we're all going to have to pay for funeral
hmm
expenses at some time, or something related to our death. We may not want a funeral, but or we may want to be cremated, but uh, you can prepay for those expenses as we get older, or as a loved one goes into a nursing home. We can prepay these expenses, and Medicaid does not consider that as an asset. So you could have a $10,000 plan sitting there with the most beautiful flowers and the best casket and all of this sort of stuff in the world planned, and Medicaid will not consider that as an available asset. It is excluded from Medicaid for Medicaid purposes. So these are a few of the primary tools we use, combined with the Medicaid Asset Protection Trust, to get someone qualified for Medicaid as quickly as possible, should they need that, you know, to qualify for Medicaid, to allow Medicaid to pay for these nursing
mm,
home expenses. So um, I do want to mention something about crisis planning. And like I said, that occurs when somebody, you know, is having to go to the emergency, or to the nursing home, and it doesn't look like they're coming out, and the kids typically panic and they need help. Um, if you are going to be doing crisis planning, especially if the person, it involves somebody with memory care issues, you need to make sure that you have a good quality power of attorney in place. And this power of attorney must specifically give you, or the person who's granted the authority to act on your behalf or on behalf of the person going into the nursing home, the authority to create and fund trusts on behalf of the grantor. Why? First of all, it's required in Kentucky if you're going to do this type of planning. But if mom goes into the nursing home, and if she has lost capacity to make transfers of assets, or she's lost testamentary capacity to create trusts, or to do anything involving her estate, if mom does not have that capacity, she cannot execute a power of attorney.
mm,
So if she has given her child or her children power of attorney, and the power of attorney allows them to do planning for their mom, then this must be spelled out in the power of attorney. And if it is spelled out, then the kids can create these trusts on behalf of their mom. They can move assets around. They can transfer the deed to the property. But without specifically stating that they have the ability to create these trusts, the Qualified Income Trust, the Martin Trust, the Medicaid Asset Protection Trust, then you can't do crisis planning on your parents' behalf. And there is no more helpless of a look in somebody's eyes than somebody there with a power of attorney that somebody drafted that is missing the right language. So please make sure. I promise you, hand to God, the man that came in recently to plan his mom's estate, he showed me the power of attorney that a lawyer had drafted for them. I flipped through it, And I looked at him and I said, "Does your mom still have capacity? Does she still have mental capacity?" And he said, "Yeah, she can still make decisions for herself." And I said, "Then we need to get a new power of attorney executed immediately, because the power of attorney that they had been operating with did not give them the ability to do this
I
type of
see.
planning. And without it, I mean, you just sit back and you watch all of these assets drain. So, that's a lot to cover in one episode. I know. The last two episodes, we went into Medicaid asset protection and elder law, and we talked about that in great detail. But it is such an important subject, isn't it, Rob? I mean, it's something that everybody's going to face if we're
Right.
lucky enough to either live old enough ourselves or to have parents or grandparents that age and get into that
Yeah.
situation. So this is certainly something that we need to know.
Back before I did this and worked in the creative realm, I used to work at a hospital, and I worked there for about 6 years. And I had, the unfortunate seat of hearing so many families that, there was an emergency or an accident, or and the resounding phrase was, "I always thought we'd have more time." And I
Mhm.
think people
Yeah,
kind of approach these end of life decisions from two different perspectives. One, they want to be very well planned, or two, they think, well, if I do it now, I'm surely going to die or wind up in the nursing home tomorrow. And I've just seen so many people just regret not having that, or that serving as a barrier to making a decision that they know their loved one would want them to make, but they can't do it legally. So taking the time, and especially working with a professional like yourself, I think is the absolute best way to mitigate any problems as you get into those situations.
absolutely. And I always tell my clients, if we can't save you money, we're not going to recommend to do certain things. Um, I think that the two, I think you hit on a really important issue actually. I think there are two, probably three, but the top two reasons that people don't do planning is because one, they think it's going to hasten their death. And I can tell you this: 28 years of doing this, I've never seen anything happen to
Yeah.
anybody. Knock on wood. I've never seen anything happen to anybody after doing estate planning. In the year or so, unless they knew that they were going to die. I've had people come in with terminal issues and they're trying to get planning in place for their children, and we get that done. But other than that, it does not.
Right.
It doesn't
Right.
jinx you. Let's just put it that way. The other thing that I think people worry about is
Mm.
the cost of planning. I can tell you that for far less than 1 month in a nursing home, for less than 1 month cost in a nursing home, you can get this planning done. And you can protect years worth of you or your loved one paying that monthly bill. And so it's it's worth it. I mean, it is absolutely worth it to come in, to sit down with us for a family wealth planning session and let us go through your assets. Let us talk with you about what would happen and see if we can make it better for you.
And a lot of people just miss uh, the security that you feel once all of those things are taken care of. It's there's no more panic whenever there's no panic on that end, at least, of the legality or having a POA or the assets secured or anything like that, when you know that it's taken care of and you've actually gone through the proper steps.
Absolutely. The comfort and peace of mind it gives people to be able to live their lives, not having to worry if something happens. I mean, I can't imagine, once you see what happens, we sit down in a planning session and you see how all of this could play out. Should something happen to you, you think about that, I'm sure. Um, but having this planned out just gives you peace of mind knowing that you're going to go through life, everything's going to be protected, everything's going to get to the people you want it to get through without being dissipated and having to be spent and exhausted on long-term care. Um, it does provide you, Rob, with that peace of mind that you were just talking about, of knowing that you've done the right
Mhm.
thing to protect your loved ones. And ultimately, at least for me, ultimately that's what it's all about. Is I look at those four kids of mine and I want them to get what I've worked hard for.
Absolutely, and that's important. And it's sad how much people have to go through because a small amount of planning wasn't done ahead of time.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it as always, man. So again, this is part 2. So part 1, if you haven't listened to it, you should have stopped 2 minutes in and have done that. But please go back and listen, as Sean does a really nice job of providing the framework for what he discussed in this episode. So thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll catch you on in that next episode in 2 weeks. Have a good one.